Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining me tonight on another episode of Unpacking, where we unpack thoughts, ideas, concepts, perspectives in the world that we live in now and in our societies. My name is Lemuel Hayatut. I'll be your host tonight, and tonight we have an incredible topic that is. We are bringing it out. This topic is coming from the recent events that have been happening in and around our country. And we're hoping to put some light into it because some of these things are becoming politicized and they're becoming issues for people, theories, conspiracy theories for people. And I brought with me, there are two people with me today that are guests that are both professors. And so they're going to discuss about the history of America and the riots that have really been a part of our nation. All right, so tag somebody, uh, share this live stream feed with your friends and family on your timeline or wherever it is. We're gonna enjoy ourselves tonight and hear some history, especially for those of us that are history buffs. It's gonna be amazing. All right, so come back and let's go. Welcome again, everybody, and thank you once again for joining us. If you have not done so already, go ahead and tag somebody, share this feed, maybe even do a watch party. And I have with me tonight two incredibly intelligent people, really versed in the area that we're going to be discussing tonight. And it's going to be about, we're going to unpack riots in light of American history. So before we get into it, just want to introduce our panel, my panel today, our guest. We're going to start with Andre, who's been with us here at Unpacking several times. And I think this is your third time, right, Andre?
Oh, yeah, two and a half.
Yeah,
Two
yeah,
and a
you were
half.
you were part of a panel, a larger panel, and then you came back, and we're so grateful to have you here. Just share with everybody who you are, what brings you to the show, and what your voice will bring tonight in this topic that we're discussing.
Absolutely. Well, as always, it's a pleasure. I am very, very honored to be here with you once again. Even when I'm not on, I'm watching because you have so many great topics and so many great conversations that need to be happening. So I appreciate that. But my name is Andre Berry, and I am in Houston, Texas, currently, where I have been pretty much my adult life since undergrad. Um, I've spent a lot of time, most of my career in the education space as a teacher and as an administrator, and more recently as an adjunct professor at the University of Houston downtown. This semester, I currently happen to not be teaching any courses, but history has always been kind of my wheelhouse, my love. It's just something that I love to talk about, I love to read about, love to study up on. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. In especially in light of everything that takes place in our modern society as well. You know, there's always a link to history that we can always draw back to. So yeah, that's me. I work in the nonprofit world. I work in church ministry as well. But just a fan of history, always seeking to learn more. Always seeking to learn more. I think the best teachers are avid learners as well.
Thank you for being with us tonight, Chris. Introduce yourself, man.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. My name's Christopher Gerdes. I'm adjunct professor at Houston Community College. I'd like to second what Andre what Andre said. That to me, the most important thing about history is that everything that happens can today can connect back somewhere. And the reason why is because human nature never changes. Human nature is always the same. Um, People make the same mistakes. They think the same thoughts.
Hmm.
Um,
So true.
so I think it's fascinating to make that connection, and that's what I like to do with my with my classes as well. Obviously, that's the key point in critical thinking, I think. Um, so I think I think that yeah, and also well, a little bit of background about me. I guess my wife is from Mexico. Uh, I have two daughters. We spent a few years living in China and Vietnam, teaching over there. And my daughters had the great opportunity of growing up abroad. And part of my angle, um, it's a global perspective. I'm a history professor, but I do fish out, and I think that's relevant again because human nature is the same everywhere in the world. Um, but specifically, I think this topic is interesting today. We bring a whole different bag of complexities that other places don't have, and that our sort of our racial history complexity is really part and parcel of our identity, the conflict, and I think this is going to be interesting. I look forward to it. That's a little about me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you guys for joining me tonight. Again, I think we came here tonight to really unpack the idea of riots because a lot of people think that these riots are based on just a certain subset of our populations. That these riots are an anomaly, and that they are produced by people that have thug mentalities, and maybe that are menace to societies, and they think that these things should not be a part of our current social dynamic. But we're here today to let people know that this is not a random thing. This is who we are as a nation. Can we unpack a little bit of the history? I don't know where you guys want to begin. Maybe Boston Massacre. I don't know where you guys want to begin. All the way, the beginning of the American Revolution. However you want to do. Let's bring people to a journey through American civil unrest, civil disobedience, and ultimate riots, and breakdown of property and all those things. So give us a little bit of a journey through time.
Andre, you were.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I was thinking that we could start with the Boston Massacre, but the more that I think about it, violence is really kind of stemmed in American culture. It's been a part. It's been rooted in our culture for a very, very long time. We marinate in it daily, and when you think about it, a lot of the holidays that we even take part in or recognize. And this goes, anywhere from Columbus Day to, some others that we'll talk about later. But let's start at Columbus Day. We still recognize Columbus Day. Many schools in many states still observe this as a day off. And what are we really celebrating? What are we observing? We're observing someone who came here for warfare. It really was a form of warfare. And so that really set the stage, okay, 1492. And while Columbus didn't step foot on mainland, North America, I get that, but this was kind of the theme of the day, right? Europe was to set out and take conquest and to take these lands by any means necessary. And this really set the precedent for what we know to be as America, North America, South America, even Canada, especially the islands. So we have violence ingrained in us. Now, have all of those been riots? Well, that's debatable. Perhaps when the natives fought back against these conquistadors or these Spaniards or these Europeans, that could be a form of rioting or protesting. It just depends on how you look at that. But
Yeah.
what we do know is that we have two two opposing sides at this time, going back centuries. And one side wanted to get one thing accomplished, and they felt what they were doing was right. And the other side was defending something which they felt was right. And neither one of those two sides could come upon an agreement. If they did, there wouldn't have been any violence to speak of. So from Cortez to Columbus to Simon Bolivar, you have nothing but violence which has been ingrained into the Western Hemisphere, right, wrong, or indifferent, okay? Because you'll have people that will defend that all day long. Well, they brought over Christianity. Well, they brought over Catholicism. Well, they tamed these people, right? And so, right, wrong, or indifferent, we know that from the outset, that's what we were founded on.
Chris, you want to share into it?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think that, you know, the history of the Americas. I mean, I would agree with Andre. I tend to, but that just as what Andre described, that also describes pretty much the rest of world history as well. You know, but it is you know, if we're speaking about our side of the world here, constant grinding with the Spanish and the English, and the grinding with the native populations. One of the things that I think, and I don't want to divert too much here, but one of the things aspects that I've thought about a lot is what's really the ironic thing about all of this grinding, you know, in the sense of you know, white settlers and Native Americans, you know, whites, you know, slave masters and white supremacy and slaves, with the exception really of the annihilation of the natives. If we look at, if we look just, we'll look at the Americas still, there really is, that grinding has really kind of produced something in South America up to Mexico. It's kind of produced a sort of a mestizo sort of race. And of course they have their own cultures, but in North America, you know, the English were much more racist than were the Spanish or the French. The English really didn't mix. There was not this thorough mixing that happened. But what's really fascinating is that somehow, some way, with this white-black tension historically that's embedded, this grinding has created something uniquely beautiful that only could be produced in America. And I'm speaking of sort of the unique culture. Let's say our music, jazz, for example, could have only emanated from the Black experience, you know, in the fields, and this conflict and this struggle for looking for some outlet of energy, right? It's really a beautiful thing in a way. So a lot of people that criticize the violence of America, to me, that I see as a distance. I remember, you know, going back, people saying, well, you Americans, you have such racial problems. You know, everybody does. I mean, you look at the French, they have the North Africans, Germans. Nobody fits in. No minority culture or national culture or minority culture sort of fits in perfectly in those countries. We have our own problems. They have their own problems, but we've really produced something uniquely American in much of our, I would say, our pop culture, and in many ways that we are. It's quite interesting that violence has beget some element that makes America a superpower. If we look at being a superpower as being a military, economic, and cultural power, part of this racial experience and what, you know, has resulted in us being a cultural superpower, and that is our export of our music, of our fashion. And that could have only happened here in America. I think that's quite ironic with all the violence, the history of this whole dynamic. To me, it's fascinating.
You know, you mentioned that the violence is kind of like, almost like, I don't know about the word synonymous, but it's, and I know it's not unique to us, but the history of violence in America, is it, if you can unpack it a little bit in light of what you just mentioned, Professor, is it possible that this violence is actually the very nature of American freedom? That the expression and the history of violence in our nation
Mhm.
is in fact part of the expression or desire of expression of the freedom of the people.
That's a very interesting way you put it. If you put it in the context of freedom being, an ongoing experiment, to make a more perfect union or become a more perfect nation, I think it probably has. The thing is it's violated a lot. There's been a lot of freedom violated along that process. It has been, a grinding effect. I wasn't expecting, hadn't thought about it in that context, but I think I've answered sort of, if you look at it in this constant journey to becoming a more perfect union, and that adventure as an expression of freedom. Well, I mean, certainly the Black Lives Matters demonstrations is that's an action of freedom of speech, and they are out there, and it is a loud movement at this time, right? So, yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. If I added anything to it at all there.
Yeah, because I'm thinking a lot of this, a lot of well, I shouldn't say a lot of it, but I'm just looking at, let's say, the Bill of Rights, right?
Mhm.
Where the First Amendment is what? The freedom of
Speech,
speech,
assembly, petitions.
assembly, all of this, and then the
Yeah.
Second Amendment is very a violent amendment almost, right?
Mhm.
It buttresses us to like, okay, I've given you a right to speak and a right to say what you want, a right to assemble peacefully, all of this stuff.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But we have the Second Amendment that almost says, look, if you, and I think when Andre and I had our discussion, I kind of mentioned it to him that the Second Amendment is saying, hey, whatever government that you put into office that does not allow you the freedoms that is given in the First Amendment, you have a right to your Second Amendment to be heard. And I think part of the desire to say, hey, we want to be heard has been
Yes.
ingrained in who we
Yeah.
are as a people.
Absolutely.
Because think about the American Revolution. It's the fact of what it, and obviously you guys know more than I do. So I'm trying to kind of understand it. Just the beginning of the American Revolution was a bunch of people saying we want to be heard, and it's an expression of our freedom, and it
Yeah.
resulted in violence because the freedoms were not being given. Am I right in that
Yeah.
matter?
Exactly. There's a real interesting correlation. I taught eighth grade history for a long time. This is when I met Chris. We were at a school district here locally. Taught eighth grade history. He was at the high school, and then I eventually went to teach 11th grade. And both of those are American history, but the eighth grade is what starts um, around the American Revolution or shortly before. Um, and so we're I'm not going to say forced, but our textbooks, and of course we're in Texas, but our textbooks teach us to teach the kids to say that all of this was justified, right? So there's a
Yeah.
real interesting correlation when you look at, you have to think about the British, and like we said, the French and the Spanish in different parts of this continent were here for hundreds of years. So what starts to happen somewhere around the 1700s is that um, those 13, those which would become the 13 colonies, start to kind of disassociate themselves with the British crown. Why did they do that? Because they felt subjugated. That's a word we use a lot today, right? They felt subjugated, they felt marginalized. The king just happened, King George III happened to pass down a lot of laws that the people felt were unjust. And so there was a lot of unrest. And so you have 300 years of more or less harmony, okay? Not talking about the Native Americans, but certainly amongst the British, right? Paul Revere and George Washington, all these guys were British. They weren't American, they were British. And
Oh,
so,
okay.
yeah, they were British. And so that's
Yeah,
one of the
I've never even really
that's one of
thought of
the
them as
one of the
British.
jokes, when we're younger, we're taught that Paul Revere went around the town in Boston saying that the British he didn't say the British are coming, everybody was British.
Mhm.
He would have said the British are
That was
coming.
very interesting.
So what happens is when you start getting all these acts, the Townsend Acts, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, these people said, wait a minute, hold on, something's not right here. We don't really feel too good about this. So let's go see what we can do. Let's start meeting. And so they had these Sons of Liberty, and they would meet in these little back rooms, and during in the middle of the night, and start to discuss what they could do about this crown that was 3,000 miles away, who was passing down these laws that were quite unfair in their eyes. The correlation that I'm trying to draw to you is that that's what people are saying now. These laws, we don't feel that these laws are quite made for us. So to go back to the 1700s, even then, it didn't just break out into all out warfare, right? Around 1770, in 1773, you had the Boston Tea Party, still was no war. Boston Massacre, still wasn't war. What you had were these little riots. They were just little pockets of violence. So you would have British soldiers who would go meet at the local pub, and they would, and so with the local townspeople, and all these years before, they got along okay. They would drink beer in the same pub. But when that subjugation and that marginalization started to set in, it was like, okay, now we're going to start picking fights with these redcoats. Now, all of a sudden, they're redcoats, and we're still not quite Americans, but we know that we don't really want to be considered British. So yeah, you had the Boston Massacre in 1773, and 5 people were shot, and what have you. And then the war still doesn't happen until 1776, when that Declaration of Independence is first written. And then the Constitution didn't happen for another 13 years after that. So I think there's a real interesting correlation with a group of people who were getting along peacefully, for the most part, for hundreds and hundreds of years, until they started to feel that they were subjugated and marginalized.
Wow. Yeah. As you were talking, Professor Chris, you can jump in at any point.
No problem. Yeah. Go ahead.
As I was thinking about this, in light of what's happening now, right? In light of our societal upheaval right now, and the divide that is really kind of going down the racial lines, people oftentimes, they look at the righteousness of violence. Because as I was listening to you, Andre, I was listening and hearing when those things were happening back 1700, in 1700, when the Americans who were, this is interesting for me, because I've never thought of it really as British people kind of like saying, hey, we want our own nation. This is the Americas now. We're going to rise and revolt because we want to be represented in whatever parliament is doing over there in England. But there was a sense of righteousness for the violence, right?
Right.
And I feel like in our society nowadays, the righteousness of violence has become racially connected. Mm-hmm. Or a subset of people, it's connected to a subset of people. And if these people are the ones making up the violent voice, then it's not righteous. Can we talk a little bit about, I know it's kind of weird, but the righteous violence, the perception that certain violence is correct, mm-hmm. and that certain violence is not correct. Can we explore that a little bit? Can we unpack that a little bit, Professor?
Yeah, I think, of course, that's antithetical to Henry David Thoreau and Martin Luther King Jr., but antithetical to the idea of nonviolence, which is a deeply ingrained, very much deeply ingrained part of our history. What was your specific question again?
So I was just discussing, as Andre was expressing about the sense of the Americans, the sense of these colonies, that they have the right to represent themselves. The expression of freedom. We're still in that kind of like that mind frame of the violence is kind of their way of expressing their freedom. They wanted the freedom without violence, but unfortunately, people did not provide, not people, but Parliament in England did not provide them the kind of liberty and freedom that they were looking for, and it moved them to a place where they had to resist and had to showcase that, hey, we want to be heard, and if it is violence, the only way that you will hear us is through this, then we will do it. And so there's kind of like a righteousness about the American violence that happened in the 1700s versus the violence that maybe we're experiencing now, that people look at it and they're like, no, this shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, it depends on the side that you're talking about. The side that is activating the protest, they certainly feel like they're righteous, that they're on the right side. I think, I think that historically speaking, if you look at, a lot of the early riots were, tax protests, whiskey rebellion, Shays rebellion. And of course, these farmers protesting against whiskey taxes, for example, would, they would raise anger, and they weren't listened to. Then they would just, take their guns, and they would, threaten to get violent, and they would. I think so. It gets to a point, in America that if protesters, or if a movement is not heard in a peaceful way, I think that you do get some justification for violence. Now, I think that's all been dismantled to a very large degree, with Martin Luther King Jr. Now, the nonviolent movement, which is a big sort of an export, supposed to be an export of America these days as well. And I think the violence, the violence that sort of emanated from all this Black Lives Matters, these were fringe groups. These were sort of, some of them were criminals. They were just by and large, the people that were engaging for meaningful change, most all of them were peaceful protesters. But I think there is a sense, kind of what you're saying, does it ever get down to the point where we feel that we have a righteous cause to get violent? I think we've seen that at times. Certainly, that expression was full blown in the racial riots in America in the early 1900s, all the way into the 20s, 30s, 40s. The Zoot Suit riots, which was Latinos, poor Latinos, basically. They were just kind of like wanting to be left alone. There's a history of police brutality again that if you're going to have sort of a history of police brutality, which we it is part of that history, you are going to have an aggressive backlash against that could be violent, and you got to sit back and listen to those people. It's no justification for killing a police officer, but at one point you have to listen to their grievances, because there must be something there. These are organic, emotional, outbursts that they didn't just come out of the blue. They have to be listened to. But I guess to answer your question, try to be more pointed. We do, there is a point where I think in our society where individuals seem where they can be pushed, and that goes for white supremacists as well, or in more recent times. But obviously, defending white supremacy was, that's not exactly a movement. That's more of an anti-progressive, sort of keep it in the keep the way our society is in the cages. I might have deviated a little, but I think that yes, it is a part, and there is a sense of self-righteousness. And I can add something later of, the Second Amendment, and how the Second Amendment is really tied historically to the white male, in a large extent, the white male mojo. But I don't want to deviate there too much. So I hope my long-winded way, I didn't, answer that somehow.
No, you're good. Part of the reason why we're here is because Andre and I have discussed, he has shared with me that these riots really, it's almost like the legacy of American freedom, the legacy of American voice, is rioting. You know, that this is not some isolated case. Andre, can you speak a little bit about that in our discussions earlier and what brought this up?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact conversation, but I know we've talked about it. And so, yeah, I was looking up a little while back. I was looking up some of the worst riots, in history. Most of them have taken place in the 50s and 60s up until today. Of course, you have the Watts riots in there. The LA riots. You have the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. You have the Democratic National Convention in there. But it's always it's almost always a reaction to some other form of violence that first took place, right? In other words, people aren't just walking around saying like, "What can I go bust up now?" It's always in reaction, and not only is it in reaction, it's because some injustice was done in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this goes back to when people feel this is almost like a human instinct. It's fight or flight. And so when you feel that you as a people, or when you feel that a group that you identify with has been marginalized, backed into a corner, when you feel like the justice system is not working for you, oftentimes this is the natural reaction. But again, I will say that I have to just really call America on the carpet and say that we have, and I know this is a family show, but we have fetishized, okay? We have fetishized violence in this country. And so it's almost a natural feeling that violence gets results, right? When else has violence not gotten a result? What war have we ever been engaged in where violence wasn't part of the equation? And listen, Chris and I could talk about this for hours. Many of our wars, or some of our wars at least, have not been the most justified, or some of our conflicts have not been the most justified. World War II was probably the last time we came together as a nation and said, okay, we're doing a good thing here. But everything from that point on, especially Vietnam. I mean, look at Vietnam. You have that the country was split, right? It was virtually split, 50-50. You had the young folks, and you had the hippies, and they didn't believe that we should have been over there. And then you have this kind of older generation who felt like we should have been over there. So there's this clash, there's this culture clash that takes place in the streets. It takes place in schools. It takes place every public, area that you can think of. There are protests, which often led to violence because a violent act took place in the first place. And those violent acts were everything from dropping napalm on villages to innocent women and children, to America firing off a bomb that got diverted and actually hit Cambodia, and which had nothing to do, they had nothing to do with the war whatsoever. So I would say that protests are always going to be the result of some origin of violence in the first place.
Yeah, and I think if I could say it for all of us here, we're not justifying violence. We're kind of like just looking at violence in light of history and how it has been used by our society to effect the change. Am I right?
Right.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too. I'll just add to that. The interesting thing is that violence has always emanated, most often emanated from groups with real grievances. The difference, I think, with African Americans, because you can look back, for example, at the other immigrants that came from Eastern Europe in the late early 1900s. Eastern Europeans, Italians, they were darker skinned, they looked different, they were Catholic, and of course the Irish, the poor Irish, they were just the ultimate white trash. The Irish were. they were, um, the Italians, they were lynched and beaten. There was a, in the turn of the century in New Orleans, there was a, there was a major event where a lot of Italians were just beaten up by the police and mobs, and they just basically kind of worked with the poor blacks. And the difference is that the Italians and the Irish became white. Okay.
Hmm.
And New York Times did a really interesting article about how it was a pretty good piece about a lot of great links to how the Italians became white. There's also another book, How the Irish Became White. It's interesting that there's also a book, how it's not titled this, but it covers how the Irish, are like the low class. How do they go from being low class white trash to being the policemen of the New York and other places, Boston. So the difference is, I think, that these sort of active, violent outbursts, perhaps, maybe they start peacefully. um, um, these other groups have been able to answer those. And I guess, like, if you look at Asians, that's sort of different. You don't see Asians aggressively, out there looking for their rights. That's a whole different.
Well, I think
more of a minority group, smaller percentage-wise. But I'm just going to finish my point up.
Yeah, go ahead.
If we look at sort of our these immigrants that came from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and they had grievances. They engaged in violence. They were definitely, oppressed, in many ways. Second-class citizens. You can research New York Times 1898 articles early 1900s, and they're literally calling, the Irish, sort of inbreds, and they're calling the Italians, like descendants from, Neanderthals, and just like uncivilized. And boy, they were talking about no political correctness in those days. But they became white. I mean, you look at it, they became part of, like,
That's interesting.
Jews are
The
white,
default,
Italians, right? Irish, but black aren't, and that has a different connotation.
Well. Yeah.
To be white, see, we don't think about that in American society. You ask a white person, like, well, what does it mean to be white? I mean, if somebody asked me to be, asked me, like, what does it mean to be white? I guess I was telling Andre or somebody, I said, I don't know. Let's see, does it mean I eat potatoes or something? I don't know. I really don't know. So you think about it, if a white person can't answer who they are, what it means to be white, how do you think they're going to be able to see through anybody else's eyes and understand that experience?
Right.
Well, in light of the breakdown that you just did when it comes to the Irish and how kind of like the migration,
and I like white people. Don't get me wrong. I like.
No, but it's interesting that you say that, because I want to kind of bring us to the heart of our situation here now. Mm-hmm. Is black violence versus white violence, and the perceptions of our society to either one. Am I right? I think that's the kind of like that's the kind of crux that we have to kind of deal with. How that certain, as you said, as these subset of people, these fractions of immigrants became what Andre put it as the default people, part of the white population. It now, like, certain types of uprising and certain types of societal what do you call that, disturbance is viewed differently in light of the racial divide. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, when we look at some of the clips of the news outlets, when white young people are rioting because their team won, versus the black community that is rioting for their freedom and their justice, is viewed so differently. These are young people getting out of hand versus these thugs that are just destroying their own community. Can we speak a little bit about that? I think that's where we want to come in and kind of tackle that and unpack that situation. What has brought that kind of difference in light of righteous, if that's kind of like a theme of righteous violence?
I'll go. not that I'm more qualified to speak because I'm Black, but maybe I am. So, let's just call out the elephant in the room. There
Yeah.
is a perception in this country that Black people are more violent. Let's just name it. We're just gonna call it what it is. There's a perception, and there always has been, okay, that Black folks are more prone to violence. And I'm gonna keep going back to this point. When did violence first start to enter this country? Certainly, slaves who were brought over in the mid-Atlantic slave trade weren't the ones who were violent, right? In fact, they had some of the worst violence you could imagine, along with Native Americans inflicted on them. So again, violence is really kind of ingrained in this society. But so then that takes me to my next point, and I think you and I talked about this. But then there's the fear factor, and I think Chris wanted to go into this, and he probably should in a minute. There's a fear factor, and that fear factor was that when African Americans were finally freed in 1865, for the most part, that they would retaliate. And all the signs pointed toward they would retaliate against their slave masters. And that's why they weren't given the freedom to own guns, right? They weren't. And it didn't happen. And it shocked the nation because it was like, wait a minute, what? They don't want to kill, so, and all they really wanted to do was just go try to live peacefully, try to rebuild a life. Many of them were so dirt poor, they had to go back into things like sharecropping, which is just a couple notches above slavery. This was my great-grandfather he was a freedman who became a sharecropper. So it just a couple of notches above slavery. You didn't have the beatings and things like that, but you were still making very, very, very low wages. So all the signs pointed toward these Black people are going to just take over this country. And so let's start stockpiling weapons. This is why Samuel Colt came up with the Colt 45 revolver, right? In the 1800s. And so all these things, and it just wasn't that. And it wasn't that. You didn't have race riots. You didn't have a race war at the time. I mean, but that was still a perception nonetheless. And then you start to kind of jump toward the mass incarcerations, okay? And of course, Black males have suffered under mass incarceration more than any other demographic by far. From anything from drugs to violence. So then now you create this really, really tense kind of relationship because now that you've incarcerated 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4, depending on where you are in the country, now you have even more tension, and it's just kind of bubbling over, and then so that's where we kind of get this this idea that it's always going to be there's this Black violence, but like, where is it? Show me where it is. It wasn't in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It wasn't in the bombing of Black Wall Street. There's never been a time in history, in American history, where Black people have even had enough power to just go into a white community and just wipe everybody out. It's never happened. It'll likely never happen. And that's why you'll often hear people say, just be glad that Black people aren't seeking revenge. All they're seeking is equality. If there were any type of race war, it would have happened long ago.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so I think people like to romanticize this idea that we stockpile these guns because it's going to come to my front doorstep. Look, if it hasn't happened by now, like if it didn't happen after slavery was ended, and after they were still rounding folks up and lynching them, and the KKK was active, what are the odds that it's going to happen now? So we have to just kind of get this out of our head that this is what drives us as a people, and when we can do that, we'll start to really take people, with more value, rather than assuming that they're all about violence, or they're coming for me, they're coming for my household, they're coming for my neighborhood. It's just not happening.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. That is interesting. If you think about, like, I mean, look at some of these rallies. If it's a MAGA rally, if it's a Second Amendment rights rally, how many black people do you see at those rallies?
Not many.
I might have seen one time. It's kind of like looking at a Trump rally. Actually, sometimes you see more blacks at Trump's rallies than you would imagine you would, but you pick out a few, right? But so they're so aggressively defending the second right. And what are they defending? They're defending some status quo, some stability that they perceive that is under threat, right? You never see blacks. I mean, with the exception of Black Panthers briefly in the late '60s. Of course, that's interesting too. That whenever blacks started arming themselves in that capacity, there were some anti-gun laws that were passed pretty quickly by the Republicans and Democrats. But if you look at you want to look at the black. I think we're talking about black violence or violence on blacks, or it was a perceived threat, right? After the Civil War was over, Reconstruction. If you read about the black lynchings, if you read the number one cause of black lynchings, and Ida Wells around 1908, whatever, somewhere around that time period, she wrote a piece, and she literally, had a list on the public records of all the lynchings, and every single one of them, the reasons for the lynchings, by and large, the vast majority were to protect white womanhood. White men came to the defense of white women. If a black man was near, if you want to look at Emmett Till, who goes into a convenience store and and says "bye, baby" to the white lady, and then she tells her husband, and he ends up, we all know what happens to Emmett Till. But Port Arthur, Texas, I think it was 1917 or 1919. That was a year of a lot of riots, and there was a lynching that took place. Actually, a mob of whites, hundreds, just attacked there was a black guy that was just smoking a cigarette too close to a white woman, and a whole violence just broke out, and several blacks were killed, and it was just absurd. You started to see, so you start to see the sort of, it's a reactionary violence, I think, sort of against these coughs and burps of black people during, especially when we get to the early 1900s and on, and particularly World War I, when you have black soldiers that go off to Europe, and they see there's no segregation. They're invited to the homes of the wonderful Dutch people, and and they and then you get into blacks, especially the art movement, musicians, jazz musicians. They were rock stars in France, in Paris. There's a great book called Paris Noir, which is about the life that not only we think of, like Ernest Hemingway and the Lost Generation, all these guys moving to France or to living in Paris, but Paris was also a big hub for black intellectuals, Langston Hughes. You look at Duke Ellington, the jazz musicians, all these guys, they went there. Miles Davis was in Paris and the music scene. He didn't want to come back. You look at Josephine Baker. When they came back, they described it a very depressing experience, the whole segregation. And so white violence, and the idea of a white man, and of course I'm generalizing here, I'm sure, maybe overgeneralizing, but that's okay. The idea of self-defense, it's as much connected back, maybe subconsciously. I think if you ask a white guy today, why they so strongly support the Second Amendment, they'll say stuff about, the government's, in case they ever try to take our rights away or whatever. I mean, like that'll, ever happen. Who knows? It could happen one day. But it used to not be that reason. You know, the machismo, the mojo of a white man carrying a gun has historically been to defend to defend white womanhood, to the purity, you know, of the white female that they were protecting. So today, I think it's more of a, I think it's more of an insecurity. You look at those that are, you know, actively of that mode. They tend to be have only high school education. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but they tend, you know, not to be college degreed or, you know, professionals. They tend to have only high school level education. They tend to be white males, middle-aged white males, and younger ones too. But I think it's an insecurity complex. I think there's something really going on, and I think there is a what the big question that should be asked by the white population today. I was talking to Andre about this. You know, whites, you know, should be asking themselves in the face of all the Black lives and the, you know, the violence. They should be asking themselves rather than anything else, why are you so upset about it? Why does this bother you so much? Why does this dig down so deeply into you and makes you so angry? Why are you so angry? Just step back and what's going to happen? You know, the real man would be someone who would just sort of, you know, a white man up and say, you know, it doesn't mean that I'm going to have my tail between my legs and have to kiss the foot of a Black man when I see him, or feel like some pity, or or feel like, oh, you know, like with my head down like that. This is this sort of this insecurity that white males really have, is this profound need to, you know, to be tough, to be sort of have this aggressive sort of realm or sort of appearance. It's very interesting. It's deeply embedded in psychology. If you keep going into that, it's you know,
Very
I'm a
interesting.
white guy, but man, I grew up with people like that, you know, and I'll get in front of any, you know, white audience and tell them straight out, man up, and just say, look, you know, white supremacy, you know, it exists, and you know, the reason you don't know it doesn't exist is because you don't have to ever question it, because it's everywhere and it's embedded in you. You don't have to think, oh, what is that? The reason you don't recognize it is because you're all part of it. It's just,
wow.
You know, that's it.
I want to add on. I want to add on to that, and we see this, and we've seen it just as recently as this this couple in St. Louis, right? And you have this crowd of people who are going to visit the mayor's office to demand some changes, and here the guy comes out with the big, you know, AR-15 that's bigger than him, and the lady with the gun. People never step foot on their property. You know, they can say they knocked the fence down and they can say all this, but you know, there's a reason that this couple is being investigated. I mean, obviously, there's some kind of wrongdoing that they're being suspected of, because we can't just have, you know, lawlessness in this country where every time somebody walks down the street, I can go and intimidate them with a gun. Now, if the circumstances are different, and they're pointing a gun at me, I mean, there's all kinds of things that might make you feel like you need to do that. But people walk up and down my street all the time. And I don't care if it's 15, 20, I don't have the right to go grab, you know, an AR-15 and stand on my porch, nonetheless, you know, pointed at them. So that's why they're being, you know, that's why they've kind of lawyered up, even though they're lawyers themselves. And the law teaches us, I know a little bit about the law, is that they've committed assault more so than that crowd committed assault, because walking down a street is not assault. If you make someone fear for their life, then that's assault. And I don't care if the gun is empty, if it's loaded.
Yeah, when they move forward with a weapon,
the minute
right?
that they stepped
Somebody
out
move
there,
forward with a weapon.
if one person in that crowd felt fearful for their lives, those two can and hopefully will be at least brought up on some kind of assault charge. Now, they might get a slap on the wrist. Who knows? They're lawyers. They'll probably get out of it. But we can't. So this kind of goes back to what Chris was saying about this this insecurity. I have to protect what's mine, right? And one of the most horrible cases, and luckily this guy has served some kind of justice, but y'all remember the case with the, there was a white male and he was waiting for his girlfriend in the convenience store, and there was some black teens in a car, and this is in Florida, playing the music too loud. and he just shot into the car. Man, he just shot into the car. Didn't call the police. He went to his hotel room, didn't report it till the next day. So that guy ends up getting arrested, and he eventually got sentenced. I don't remember how much time he got, but yeah, just shot into the car, killed the kid, the black teenager, because he felt, in his words, he felt threatened, and all they were doing was playing loud music. None of them had guns or anything like that. So we have to stop this perception that somebody looks at me the wrong way. I mean, this isn't the Wild West, right? This is not the Wild West. Somebody looks at me the wrong way. Somebody walks in front of my property, or says something I don't like. But certainly that translates also toward, oh, I don't like what I see on TV. You know, I don't like these protests that I'm seeing on TV. Therefore, I must speak out against it. Therefore, I must go get more ammunition for my gun, because it's not long before they'll be in my neighborhood. It's just not happening.
Interesting about kind of like that fragility of the white male, if we could use that term.
There's a book out. It's the book's been out for a few years. Yeah,
Yeah.
nails it.
Yeah.
But actually, I have next Monday I will be speaking to an author, and I believe he's a psychologist, or a psychotherapist. I'm not too sure exactly what he's, but anyway, he's a counselor. He's written a book about, you know, that kind of STEAM issues, you know, and it's not necessarily about race, but just males and their, you know, lack and their sense of whatever it is that is being portrayed by this thing that I have to say that I have to defend myself and be this kind of male. You know, people are set up in such a way that certain groups of people, certain groups of males feel compelled to be this person, and now they're falling into this trap of trying to be somebody that they're really not. You know, but
also, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's also, you know, this sort of collective psychology of, you know, if you were to isolate one of these white guys on their own by themselves, they sort of like, they can be pretty nice people, but there is this tendency to, you know, you sort of be, you know, there's for some reason, I think I have, you know, some good ideas, but it's interesting to think about it. There is this sense of emasculation that has happened to white males, and they feel more powerful in these sort of bigger movements, these sort of armed movements where they're with another group of armed men, and it's empowering. It's certainly more than what they would have, you know, been, you know, with their, you know, nothing little selves all alone there. It's a magnification. I mean, it's you know, that's psychologically been all kind of studies. Of course, you jump on a group movement and you become part of a movement and you become bigger than yourself, right? You tie that in with sort of this, I guess you'd say, economic, you know, we're in the post-industrial era where a lot of jobs are lost and people are, you know, machines are replacing manual labor, and so, you know, not everybody's going to be qualified to study finance and engineering. Everything else is going to go to robots one day. So you're going to have I think this is going to get worse because you're going to have, you know, as we move more towards technology and artificial intelligence, more jobs are going to be lost. You know, trucks are going to be automatic driven, and, you know, eventually one day we'll be to the point where nobody owns cars, where you know, Uber and you know, you pay so much money for your car insurance and your car payments, and it's like the biggest investment we have that just sits there, we don't use 90% of the time. So and it'll be cheaper too to just on demand, you know, call where you want to go. So we're moving in that direction. I think that it's it could potentially get worse as you see, you know, the racial tension. I hope not. But as more jobs go to artificial intelligence, then you have the whole other thing, like Andrew Yang. He's not the first one who talks about a permanent monthly income. But then you have other issues, like what do you do with a bunch of, you know, are people going to be idle? You know, what are they going to do with their lives? You know, probably not, but that's a whole different story. I'm just kind of looking ahead to where we're going, and what contributes to this sort of aggressiveness of, I think, of the white male. And there is this correlation of, it seems like if they just jump up and get a college degree, certainly a master's degree, they're not going to be so tied up with the Second Amendment and with this masculinity thing. There's just something amazing about education.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of like routes we've just taken. So many things to talk about and discuss in these things, but I want to bring us back a little bit to the idea of riots, black riots versus white riots, and during the times that we just faced recently, a lot of people mention. I think Chris, you mentioned it about MLK. A lot of people mentioned about, hey, look, back in the 60s, it was all, look at MLK. He was so nonviolent. The protest, there was no riots. But a lot of people, I think, are misguided in the way that that the civil rights movement of the 60s was presented, no?
Yeah.
Andre?
Yeah. The 60s were certainly full of, listen, I mean, anytime that you can turn on the TV and see, fire hoses and German shepherds and police just, beating children and women down, that's going to, again, cause this tension, right? And so it wasn't all MLK. It wasn't all Selma. We like to remember it as Selma, but it wasn't all Selma. There were plenty of Malcolm X's, and there were plenty of later on, Black Panthers and even Marcus Garveys and folks like that. Now, that's not to say that they were out there advocating violence, but, there were those like Malcolm X who at one time probably had just as large a following as Martin Luther King, who said, we're not going to go out and pick a fight, but if violence comes to you, you can certainly meet that violence now. And you can say that's not the right way to go, about an eye for an eye, but that was also a growing movement, and so there were thousands upon thousands of Black Americans who were almost kind of torn and split. But yes, you had Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King, I think we celebrate and remember him because he did what most of us, 99% of people, I'm just guessing, wouldn't have had the just even the resilience to do. I mean, here's a guy who's arrested 30 something plus times, beat over the head with bricks, beat by the police, thrown in jail, left to die. I know I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it, but God picked him for he was the right person at that time. But he didn't have an easy life. The FBI was tapping his phones. I mean, they were sending letters to his wife, making him out to be a cheater. I mean, he was called a communist. So he wasn't well liked. He was one of the most hated people in America at the time. And most of us couldn't have done what he did. And here's a person who never raised a hand or a fist toward anyone. But most of the leaders of the time didn't either. But what some of them did, and again, Malcolm X said that you have to protect your woman first. That's what he preached, is protect your woman first. And if they try to take you out, well, then you make sure that you take them down right there with you. I don't know. I don't have numbers to tell you how many protests that led to directly or indirectly, or how many riots that led to directly or indirectly. But it wasn't all, just peaches and strawberries and all that stuff in the 60s. There was a lot of violence. There were a lot of people who didn't make it home at night. There were a lot of people who were thrown in jail without a trial. There were a lot of men who never got to see their families again. Also, you need to remember that, and I don't want to divert too much, but one of the stats I see thrown around a lot today is that, the Black male is absent from the household so much. Well, do you realize that started in the 60s and 70s? There was an all-out war on the Black male in America. And it started with the civil rights movement, and it continued with the war on crime and the war on drugs. And so some say that there was a deliberate attempt by the government to take the Black male out of the equation because he was the biggest
Andre,
threat.
let me interject you there. Yeah, it even goes further back than that, doesn't it? When the white slave master could separate the families.
Sure, yeah.
Black families were destroyed, early on.
But But with that freedom, and with the passage of civil rights laws, then he becomes even 10 times or 100 times more of a threat. He wasn't as much of a threat when he was a slave, because you could keep him in chains. But when you start to pass, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Acts, now he's a big threat. So what do you do to your threat? If you can't just outright kill him, which we know happened also, but if you can't just outright lynch him and kill him like they did in the South, well, we'll throw him in jail, and we'll trump him up on some charges and make sure that he doesn't step foot back in his home again. So, I dare anyone to tell me these days how absent the black male is from the household without going back to 50 and 60 years ago when my parents were alive, when the black male was deliberately taken from his neighborhood and from his home.
That's another area that we can unpack, right?
Yeah, no.
the fatherlessness that maybe is prevalent, or at least people make it out to be this prevalent in the black community, and where is it coming from, right? It's not like just black males decided we don't want to be fathers. There's something that produced that, or some
Right.
external force.
Yeah.
And we could unpack this, and maybe we need to come back and kind of discuss,
We might.
the history of the black male, and maybe the black family, and kind of explore, because I look at it, and not to be on a tangent, because that's not what we're trying to unpack today, but
Right.
looking at the history, and I'm not a history buff like you guys, certainly no professor, but looking at the history, there was no issues with black families prior to them being emancipated. There was no issues of black violence prior to the emancipation, and prior to the 13th Amendment. Until the 13th Amendment showed up, then all of a sudden blacks became violent and became less family oriented. It's a very weird, I don't know if there's a history, if it's been studied, but that would be an interesting study, no? I don't want us to get into it, but.
Yeah, I was just going to add that every time, first of all, every meaningful social change that's ever happened in America has started from the bottom, right? It's women's movement, civil rights movement, etc. But if you go back, every time there's been an uprising, for those that are trying to come up, if it's the labor movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, if it is the civil rights movement, the labor movement, and during that time period, they were accused of being socialists. And if you look at Martin Luther King Jr., there were many that were accusing the civil rights movement people as being communists. And then, of course, now the Black Lives Movement today, they're tied in, there's an attempt to tie it into social anarchy and chaos. So there's always some exterior motive, or there's something, outside force, rather than looking within and trying to really solve our issues. And that usually comes from the right wing of politics. It always does, generally speaking. But that's an interesting angle as well.
Yeah, and I think in our discussion and what we're kind of really pursuing here, our topic again is riots in light of American history. And a lot of times what you said is people are getting painted a certain brushstroke of paint, Marxism, leftists, all these socialist type of names that people are putting onto the Black Lives Matter movement, not necessarily the organization, because the two may be different, but just the idea of American, at least when I look at my timeline in the social media, a lot of people that pretty much are looking at these riots that have come through and these protests that have come through as almost like this act of aggression against the current government is really based on people that are
our values are under attack. That's what the perception they want out. Our values under attack. And that goes back to make America great again. Make it great again for who? It's what? What you can define all that. It's we're under attack.
Yeah. Well, I think, kind of, this may not be a good, a well-received take, but we are making America great again in the sense that the voice of the unheard is being heard, and the voice of the disenfranchised are rising up. The greatness of America
That's right.
is the fact that we have expressed our liberties and our freedom
Right.
through expressive means, whether
Right.
protest or
Right.
whether
I'll
at the court,
Yeah.
some
I'll add,
violent riots.
sorry. Yeah, I'll add something. I'm looking again for, a very strong Christian wave, progressive wave in this country, because the dominant, Christian element is, the evangelical strain, which is kind of reactionary. It's knee jerk, like stop anything, and it's very centered around, white identity. Um, that's been the driving force. The moral majority in the 1980s, Jerry Falwell and the evangelicals, they're really latching on. That's the reason. To me, it's sort of maybe it's a last gasp. They're latching on to someone who's so not even immoral but amoral as Trump. And I'm ready for a Christian progressive movement that that looks and sees change as a positive end, like it was during the progressive era. It was largely driven by Christian progressive
That's right.
women. Hopefully
That's right.
that'll come back. You know.
Well, if Andre's got anything to do with it, it probably will come back. And the people that we run with, in the circles we run with.
Yeah, I think we have to kind of get out of this this mentality that liberal is a bad word when it comes to Christianity, and that conservatism is the only right word. We just have to break ourselves out of this thinking, because it's not true. I'm meeting more and more people every day who are Christian, who are progressive, and so like Chris said, I'm hopeful that it can happen, but still, what's taught in the churches that we attend, again, I won't name my church, but the churches that we attend, is that liberalism is a bad word. But a minute ago, you just said the word liberty, and that's the root. I mean, to be liberal doesn't have to be a bad thing. It just means to liberate from something, and in this case, we're liberating ourselves from, again, laws and history that we know were not meant to always protect everyone. In fact, the vast majority of American history, they were only meant to benefit one demographic, and that is white males. Now, other people came along into the fold years and years and years later, and decades and centuries later. But to liberate yourself away from that type of thinking is not a bad thing. In fact, if you're not making progress, then something's wrong. And I would call, if we just want to bring it all the way back to the American Revolutionary War, those were liberals. They were liberals. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There were conservatives, and they were called loyalists. And those loyalists to the crown were the Benedict Arnolds of Boston and the Benedict Arnolds of New York City. It was those who said, well, why do we need to change anything? We've had it good. It's kind of like the house slave, if we want to take it there. Why do we have to change anything? Let's just be satisfied. But no, these liberal colonists said, no, it gets better. It gets better. We deserve better. And we owe it to ourselves to seek that out. So they were very much progressives at the time. So I don't know how we got to a point where progressive, to be progressive is a bad thing. We've always been progressive in this country.
Well, I think to what Chris you mentioned about Make America Great Again, the greatness of America is being able to progress forward and to see the liberties of people and to pursue justice and pursue equality. And people may not see it that way on that side of the aisle. They might think Make America Great Again is white supremacy or all of this. But I think the greatness of America is the people, the common people coming together to make a difference over something that they see is unjust, And I think I want to get back to the beginning of your opening statements, Chris, about the humanity and how that really we are unchanged over time.
Absolutely.
that there is this, no matter if it was 5,000 years ago or what have you, or there's always this thing in humanity that seeks for freedom and that seeks for equality, and that the voice sometimes that is pressed and that is what do you call it, oppressed will rise up. And that's a human thing. So in our closing portion here, in the next couple of 10 minutes, let's talk a little bit and maybe share our viewpoint on what it is that we're doing currently that is being happening in our society now in 2020 that is actually a good thing, even though it's perceived maybe as something that it's not. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Have to think about that for a minute. Andre, you got something in mind? You want to go first, or?
So what are we doing that's good? So how are we kind of moving the needle? Is that the question more or less?
What I'm saying is that that human history has shown to us, right? And you guys
Mhm.
correct me if I'm wrong. Human history has shown to us the propensity of humanity to rise
Mhm.
up when they're
Right.
oppressed and unheard.
Sure.
And so in our society today, a lot of people are looking at the riots and the protests that have come before and think of
Mhm.
it as negative. And I want
Right.
us to kind of present that these are actually it's more positive probably
Mhm.
than you perceive it, than society is perceiving it to be.
Right. Yeah, I think the problem with that, and I can sit here and tell you that most of what I've seen um, are positive changes. Most of what I've seen are moving the needle, and the problem is that you're always going to have those rebuttals. You're always going to have those who say, well, they went about it the wrong way. So let's talk about some of those things. So personally, just in my humble opinion, to start to think about what we're doing with these Confederate statues and schools that are even named after Confederates, good thing. I think it's a good thing. I've always believed that, and that didn't start this year, because what happens, and especially as a Christian, when you start building 50-foot statues of people, that really gets close to idolatry, right? I mean, you're really idolizing something, but even beyond that, much deeper than that, is there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain behind that people don't quite understand. Now, again, if you're not willing to see it from someone else's eyes, then you'll never think anything's wrong with it, or you'll think it should just stay the way that it is. But part of humanity is to empathize and to see yourself through someone else's eyes. So we know that for 100 and 150 years, these statues have been, look, there's statues as far north as Montana. How can statues be about Southern pride if it's in Montana? It doesn't get any further north than that. So we know what it's about. Okay, so we don't want, I don't advocate graffiti and violence and destruction of property, but it's starting to get some attention, right? And so you'll certainly see things being done the right way because people called attention to it. And again, that didn't just start this year. One of the things I wrote about not too long ago is there's more Confederate named schools in this country than there are after Martin Luther King. And so we always, again, we romanticize MLK, and we don't even have as many schools named after him as we do Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a
That's crazy.
thing, KKK Grand Wizard for crying out loud. So those are good things. You're always going to have that group who says we're going to forget history. We'll forget history if we do that, and that's of course ridiculous. What else are we doing? I mean, we're starting to see certain laws that are passed. I mean, with these protests, we're seeing action done in a way faster than I've ever seen it done before. I mean, it took less than a week for George Floyd's, for those officers to be brought up on charges. After the, I know in my gut that other than cell phone footage, if it weren't for those protests, those arrests wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened 20, 30 years ago. It didn't happen even with Rodney King, even with those 4 police officers, and then they ended up getting off scot-free as is. So protests can work. It starts to get attention, and I don't think the point is to strike fear into people's hearts, but I think it is to say, hey, we're here, we're not going away, and we'll start looking at other ways to do it if you don't want to do this peacefully. So again, not an advocate of violence by any means, but most of those protests were nonviolent. Um, I don't know, Chris, you want to jump in? Those are the two that jump off.
Yeah.
To me.
I was just going to say, I think since the 80s, we've really seen this sort of movement to sort of dismantle, the government, that government is bad somehow, that big government is bad. Nobody's saying an inflated, government, whatever that is. But I mean, you think about it, every change that has benefited anybody in this country has come from the bottom up. Um, you look at the women's rights, civil rights. You look at you want to talk about government. I don't see anybody like Gerdes is one of my favorite writers. He writes a lot on income inequality and wealth inequality in the U.S. and around the world. I don't see anybody complaining about Social Security. That was a government impetus. Medicare. These are rather than stripping and ripping the government apart like we've been doing since the 80s. The whole thing is that it can be stripped apart, and then those that want that to begin with, they can point to its ineffectiveness because it is less effective because it's all stripped down. They could say, look, it's no good. So therefore, let's let these wealthy philanthropists take charge of education initiatives, of healthcare initiatives, and all these things. That should be put right back into the lap of the government. State and federal, particularly the federal government. A lot of these, I think that a lot of that's why I think this movement is this Black Lives Matters movement. I think this is positive. It's coming from the bottom up, and hopefully it'll lead to some legislative changes. And hopefully, this is the last. I think I predict. And what do I know? But I don't think Trump is going to get reelected now more than ever. I think this is sort of a last, gasp and cough and, just sort of the last grasp from this, element, maybe hopefully forever, but largely because immigration is largely changing the complexity of our country and the demographics. But I think that's what's positive. That is nothing to be afraid of. I mean, Jefferson said every now and then we need, revolution is a good thing, and not necessarily revolution in the sense of a real revolution, but this is very positive. This is the direction we need to go to, and hopefully, any meaningful change, legislative change, has always started from the bottom, and moved its way up, and then it's become institutionalized. That's what it takes. But there are strong forces against that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the positive thing I'm seeing, and I'm thinking this is where we're moving to. I hope, just having someone like Trump, he's moved the needle so far, from objectivity. I mean, I would rather have somebody like Mike Pence, who I really don't like his policy and I wouldn't like him, but at least you can have different arguments. You wouldn't be arguing about the, insanity of a person, or the competence, or the abject, desire to harm and divide people, like just over the table, right? But that's enough about Trump. But I just think that this move is positive, and I think we're moving in the right direction. And I think it needs to be, we need to grab it and run with it, and pressure needs to be put on our politicians. History, it moves in these different directions. We're likely to go back into the direction of a little bit, bigger government. I mean, think about it. Make America great again. What does that mean? It doesn't mean the same for Black people as it does white people. What do you want? Make it a great again whenever there were Jim Crow laws and segregation? I mean, what are you talking about? Maybe it was make it great again when income taxes were 70, 90% in the 1950s, which they were, and the economy was in a golden age, right? But we need to redefine a lot of these notions, and we need to try to dissolve and attack the idea that there needs to be fear of change. We need to dismantle and reteach this idea of socialism, because socialism, nobody knows what it is. Nobody's advocating that we move to the path of socialism. I mean, we have it already in the school districts are examples of socialism. The post office is. People really don't know. They need to be reeducated. but we're so tribal right now.
You're throwing a lot of luggage language for us.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of things that we could unpack for the next 3 hours.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that this grassroots movement, I think this is positive, and this is the way we might historically be in a swing back in that direction, like we were with New Deal, Great Society stuff. We definitely need universal health care. That would be one of the crowning moments, because, well, stop right there.
I just want to.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
I want to add just real quick that, with Black Lives Matter, a lot of what people have a problem with is just that it says the word Black, period. Okay, let's just be honest. And so it's a good thing. It's a great thing. It really can bring about change, but you're always going to have people that are going to say, what do you mean Black? What about me? We could call it anything. Okay. But I think Chris is right. It hasn't gone away. Black Lives Matter didn't start this year. It started with Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And it hasn't gone away, and I don't think it will. It's only gained momentum. And so I'm proud of a people, Black, white, Latino, who can all come together and say that this is a thing. Because then what will start to happen is then we'll start to feed off of other injustice moments that are taking place too, like the military young lady whose body went missing, and I still don't think we know everything about that. And so I'll see on my Facebook timeline people of all colors supporting that. So it's like, oh, okay, you supported something I'm passionate about. Well, I got your back on the next thing. And again, like Malcolm X said, there's more of us than there is in them. So if we really just kind of hold strong, feed off of each movement and do it in a way, and do it in a civilized way, and follow the law, then we will start to see some change.
And if young people vote, that's the whole key. Young people have to vote. They don't vote. Yeah. They can vote. That's it. Simple.
Yeah, and I think I'm trying to kind of grab what is being spoken tonight, and that is really kind of historically our country and the nation and the history of the nation has been really a landmark for democracy, freedom, liberty all across the world. I mean, I think if these kinds of things were happening, let's say in Saudi Arabia, it'd be a totally different conversation. Hong Kong is kind of like, close to what we're trying to do here. And that's really kind of like a population freedom rather than a racial freedom. And I think what we're doing here is kind of showing and expressing the American strength, and that is the voice of freedom among people to be able to vocally and if not physically express their right to be heard and express their right to be seen.
Let me add one final thought there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. When I start my classes with my students, the very first thing I ask them is, what does it mean to be American? And nobody's, a lot of international students too, they can't say it's a real holy soil we're bowing down to. It's not a race. It's not a religion. It really is what it means to be American. I mean, something has to unite us, right? It confuses them. I let the course go on, and until we start looking at the history, and it really is ideas, and it's an ideology that defines us, and it is that aim for perfection, and that is what it means to be American. It's the ideas of a more perfect union of all men are created equal. It really is. We move toward it. That's what's remarkable, and that's what makes me proud to be American.
Yeah. I think Andre was mentioning a lot of times the laws were skewed towards a more elite or more white people, but I was talking to my wife and we were kind of like exploring it. And again, we're not history buff. She's more than I am, but we were kind of looking at it, and really all the laws seems to be very good. All men are created equal, certain unalienable rights. All these things are on paper. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Or on paper, they're fantastic.
Yeah,
the pursuit of it.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the pursuit of it, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, the pursuit of the ideal, American ideal of freedom. In fact, MLK's I Have a Dream speech speaks of that, that the pursuit of this equality, is really what we're looking at. We're not looking for the changes to happen. We're looking for the things that have been established to happen for everyone.
Yeah, I like to see it as like a template. The American ideal is a template. It's a model, and it certainly applied to a smaller group of people when it first came out. But the words are eternal. The words, they apply now as they did then. They may have a different context. It's certainly, we've enlarged the pool, and it means all of mankind, right? But the words are eternal. The words, it's a template. It's a model. And I think that's why I think Barack Obama was like, somebody asked him, well, those were slave owners. And well, yeah, I get it. It's complex. But, Jefferson's idea, it's, you don't have to necessarily honor him as the flawed human that he certainly was. But the idea, well, the idea survives. And that's what makes us all Americans.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for joining me tonight. And I think I certainly enjoyed it immensely. I hope you guys enjoy the conversation as well. Next week, actually, I will have I have it here. He's a doctorate level clinical psychologist. He's written a book called Childhood Trauma and the Non-Alpha Male, to a little bit to what you were saying, Chris. Wow. And so we're going to talk about, the beauty and the need for therapy next week, so we're going to explore that for unpacking for this coming Monday. But for us here and the idea of rioting and violence, and again, we want to state to everybody that all of us in this panel tonight, all this discussion, we are not pro-violence, but we are pro-liberty. And the voice of freedom and equality must be heard. And if it's not heard, then it must be felt and seen. And so that's what we have seen in our history and what we are seeing now in our current society. And I think to speak to the idea of make America great again, I think if we really go down to the roots, and you guys, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the roots of American greatness is the fact that we are able to express ourselves in ways that that we will pull together to make sure the things that we deem right are corrected. Right? So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris. Again, incredible time. I hope to have you guys come back again. Andre, thank you for coming. And maybe we can talk about and unpack the Black family and the history of the Black male. That would be an interesting conversation.
Let's do it.
But again, thank you all for joining us. And for those of you that are watching or that will be watching, go ahead and share your comment or anything like that, and we will come and address it again. Andre, I'm sure we will come and discuss any questions that you may have. Thank you again, and until next time.